Our group for the Words Matter Revolutionary Rhetoric project was Cooper Beard, J.T. Efes, and Nathaniel Fagelson, and the source we chose to analyze was Against the Writs of Assistance, which is a speech. So the speaker who gave this speech was James Otis, and James Otis was a lawyer from the colonies. We can learn about him from this quote in the third paragraph of his speech, when he says, quote, "I was solicited to argue this cause as Advocate General, and, because I would not, I have been charged with desertion from my office," end quote. First, Otis states that he was Advocate General, which is most similar to the position that we now call Attorney General, although there is no direct comparison. They are a high-ranking lawyer in the government responsible for enforcing laws. Today, this position is found in the executive branch of a state or federal government, and in this case, Otis was from Massachusetts. The domain he was responsible for was the Admiralty Court, and the Admiralty Court dealt with maritime trade as well as enforcing punishments for smuggling. He lost his position for failing to, quote, "argue this cause," end quote. In other words, Otis would not enforce the writs of assistance. We can also make some reasonable assumptions about Otis from this passage. He was probably relatively wealthy, given that politics were dominated by the upper class in this era. Otis' status can also give some insight into his possible biases and motives. The writs of assistance were primarily a response to the widespread smuggling of goods by colonists, and those who ran the largest smuggling operations would need to have enough money to do so. They would likely be wealthy merchants. And thus, it is important to keep in mind why the writs of assistance may have mattered to Otis more than some others.
Now for some historical context. During the French and Indian War, the British needed money to pay for their military forces in the New World, and did so via taxes and enforcing regulations on the colonies, which had previously been unregulated due to salutary neglect. Originally, the Molasses Act of 1733 and other similar acts, known collectively as the Navigation Acts, charged duties on molasses, sugar, rum, and other commodities that were imported from non-British suppliers. This was seldom enforced, however, due to the aforementioned salutary neglect. Due to this lax enforcement, smuggling was commonplace, which prevented revenue from going to the British. In Massachusetts, where smuggling was most common, the royal governor Sir Francis Bernard allowed the writs of assistance to be authorized in 1760 in order to confiscate smuggled goods and ships. One reason for his approval was that a portion of the proceeds from selling confiscated ships went back to the governor. The writs of assistance itself was a search warrant which could be used to search houses and ships for smuggled goods. These warrants only expired after the death of the king and were transferable, so a person who had a writ could give it to another person. As well, any location could be searched by the holder of the writ, and they were not liable for the destruction of property. Originally, a specific warrant was needed in order to search for goods, so many colonists viewed this change as a violation of their rights as British subjects. The speech was written for a court case known as the Petition of Lakemere against the writs of assistance. James Otis was originally the Advocate General of the Admiralty Court, which dealt with legal matters regarding naval law. When he was asked to defend the writs of assistance, he resigned and promptly joined a group of Boston merchants to oppose the writ and argued that it was unconstitutional and violated English common law.
While the audience isn't specifically described in the excerpt, we can infer that the audience is on the side arguing in favor of the writs. The judge and the attendees of the trial. While the attendees and the opposing counsel have already come to a conclusion regarding the legality of the writ, the judge has not come to a conclusion. The judge is most likely very rich and has a very high status, which could influence his position on the issue. On the other hand, he could have been appointed by a loyalist. James Otis's ultimate goal was to strike down the legality of the writs of assistance. He is ultimately trying to convince the judge. You can learn about how adamantly he is opposed to the writs by examining this quote from the second paragraph. Quote, "I will do to my dying day oppose with all the powers and faculties God has given me, all such instruments of slavery on the one hand and villainy on the other, as the writs of assistance is." End quote. Otis is doing all in his power to do whatever it takes to stop the writs of assistance. Another example of this is his 5-hour-long grueling speech in front of the judge. Otis even went as so far to quit his elite job as Advocate General. Otis has given up a lot in order to fight for what he believes in. Otis says that what he's doing is for his country. While Otis does argue for writs in some cases, Otis argues against the writs of assistance by mentioning that past writs have been granted after sworn testimony mentions something specific that needs to be investigated. Now, the writs are too general. In the eyes of a British, bare suspicion without oath is sufficient. Writs can now be granted by praying, which Otis strongly argues against. Otis also helps his case by arguing that writs are an example of extreme overreach/control by the British. Lastly, Otis argues that writs could be used to exercise revenge against someone.
So now we're going to take a look at how Otis moves through his argument and what sort of rhetorical devices he uses. And one thing to keep in mind here is that we might be analyzing the same quotes for these choices, these rhetorical devices, as well as the tone and the appeals, and that just reveals how a rhetorical device can also tie into an appeal or into the tone that he creates. So Otis begins by addressing why he is in the courtroom that day, and he begins by using hyperbole at the end of this first section, comparing the writs to, quote, instruments of slavery, end quote. And this is a hefty claim. Otis is setting himself up to prove this assertion as his speech continues. And later, Otis moves into discussing why he must argue this cause. He explains the historical significance of fighting against tyranny, stating that tyrannical ruling, quote, in former periods of history cost one king of England his head and another his throne, end quote. If you recall this from world history, when Otis talks about the beheading of a king, the historical reference he's making is to the English Civil War. This war was a result of King Charles I attempting to exert too much power over Parliament, leading to an uprising against him. This is an extremely effective example to use because Otis is demonstrating how English blood has already been spilled over similar issues throughout history. So Otis is connecting his argument to the concerns of both loyalists and the concerns of patriots. Next, moving through his argument, Otis explains why others should join him in this fight, stating that, quote, the only principles of public conduct that are worthy of a gentleman or a man are to sacrifice estate, ease, health, and applause, and even life, to the sacred cause of his country. These manly sentiments in private life make good citizens. In public life, the patriot and the hero, end quote. This statement is directed more towards the colonists who feel a strong American identity. Otis here, he's setting up a logical fallacy, claiming that the only way to be a good citizen and patriot is to sacrifice something for one's country, when in reality there's a plethora of ways to sacrifice for one's country, to be a patriot. And so, however, this is a convincing way to call Otis' fellow colonists to action to fight against the writs of assistance. Next, as we move further throughout his speech, Otis begins to explain why the writs of assistance are problematic and should be struck down. He argues that the current system allows the British to issue a writ without any probable cause. Otis then declares that, quote, it is a power that places the liberty of every man in the hands of every petty officer, end quote. This is another hyperbole and is used to scare the colonists into feeling that their security and freedom are in immediate danger, as nearly any Brit has power over them. However, Otis also offers a concession when he says that, quote, I admit that special writs of assistance to search special places may be granted to certain persons on oath, end quote. Otis makes his argument more reasonable by explaining under what conditions he believes searches to be acceptable, and we'll also explore the significance of this proposal in a few minutes. And moving further throughout his speech, Otis moves on to discuss some of the potential consequences of not striking down the writs of assistance. His use of hyperbole continues as he states that, quote, everyone with this writ may be a tyrant, murder anyone within the realm, and that the, end quote, and that the writ is, quote, perpetual, there is no return, end quote. The picture that Otis paints of this being the last chance to escape a world of tyranny and murder is another example of his use of hyperbole to scare the court into striking down the writs. Otis also makes a powerful biblical reference when he claims that, quote, what is this but to have the curse of Canaan with a witness on us, to be the servants of servants, the most despicable of God's creation, end quote. He is referencing here the curse of Canaan, a story in the Bible in which God curses the Canaanites to being, quote, servants of servants, end quote. So yes, Otis did pull his word choice directly from the Bible to strengthen his reference. Otis presents the case that if the colonists don't seize their opportunity to get rid of the writs of assistance, they will become British slaves. And after recognizing the more ideological and hypothetical aspects of his argument, Otis moves into providing more specific details about the writs of assistance. He says that, quote, the Menial servants of custom house officers may enter, may break locks, bars, and everything in their way, end quote. The repetition of may emphasizes all the ways that the British can infringe upon the colonists' liberties. We also see an interesting choice of words here. This is the second time that Otis describes menial servants. Earlier, he describes how, quote, their menial servants are allowed to lord it over us, end quote. If we remember who his audience is, the reason why Otis chooses this word is pretty clear. The members of the court are likely wealthy because wealthy people made up most of who was in power at this time. And so these wealthy court members would not want low-ranking British soldiers, some of whom who were likely poor, to have any power over them. So in my opinion, this is a pretty effective use of what is essentially classist use of language.
Otis effectively uses pathos and ethos to convince the audience to hopefully vote against the writs. Due to Otis previously being an advocate general and currently being a lawyer arguing against the writs, Otis establishes credibility. Because Otis is an established lawyer, Otis is able to use language and emotion that he will hopefully be able to convince the audience to vote in a particular way. Otis uses sentences such as, quote, now one of the most essential branches in English liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is well guarded as a prince in his castle. This writ, if it shall be declared legal, would totally annihilate this privilege. Custom house officers may enter our houses when they please. We are commanded to permit their entry. Their menial servants may enter, may break locks, bars, and everything in their way. And whether they break through the malice or revenge, no man, no court can inquire. Bare suspicion without oath is sufficient. End quote. This quote is meant to make the audience feel threatened by these writs. Because the audience is full of regular people who aren't part of the elite, Otis says that the writs are universal. That makes the audience question whether it may happen to them.
Moving on with more choices, Otis offers us an anecdote to explain the ridiculousness of the writs. And I'm not going to read this entire anecdote, but it's up at the top there. He's basically telling us a story about someone who kind of used the writs as leverage over someone else. And as he concludes what we have of his argument, and he concludes discussing the consequences of allowing the writs to remain in place, Otis introduces yet another hyperbole. He says that, quote, one arbitrary exertion will provoke another until society be involved in tumult and blood, end quote. This is an extension of the earlier hyperboles that envision a society ruled by violence and anarchy. Unfortunately, from this point onwards, Otis' speech is only preserved as part of a summary by John Adams, so we will focus more on the account of how he argued the case, some of the logical skills that he used, and the specific language and choices.
The quote from John Adams, quote, his right to life, his liberty, no created being shall rightfully contest, nor was his right to his property less incontestable. The club that he snapped from the tree for a staff or for defense was his own. His bow and arrow were his own. If a pebble he had killed by a partridge or a squirrel, it was his own. No creature, man or beast, had a right to take it away from him. If he had taken an eel or smelt a scorpion, it was his property. Adams, end quote. Adams wants the audience to understand that property belongs to individuals and not under threat by government officials. This should be common sense, but apparently the British doesn't understand that.
Now for the tone. Throughout his speech, James Otis switches from a respectable and inquisitive tone to an enraged one. This can be seen in the opening paragraphs where he starts off his speech with respectful words such as in the sentences, quote, may it please your honors, end quote, and, quote, appear not only in obedience to your order, but likewise in behalf of the inhabitants of this town, end quote. Considering this is in a courtroom, his respectful words to the court and judges help create the image of a civil and humble character. Then in his next paragraph, he uses much stronger language such as it, being the writs of assistance, appears to me as the worst instruments of arbitrary powers, the most destructive of English liberty, end quote. This helps create a difference in the way he presents himself and the issue at hand, which helps convinces the audience of the audacity and evil of the writs of assistance. In the next paragraph, Otis goes into detail about why he is opposing the writ and shows a clear determination to defend his opinion in the sentence, quote, I renounce that office being the position of Advocate General, and I argue this cause from the same principle, end quote. And, quote, the only principles that are worthy of a gentleman or a man are to sacrifice estate, ease, health, and applause, and even life to the sacred cause of his country, end quote. These sentences show the listener that he is determined to fight for what he thinks is right, even if it becomes a burden. Otis goes back and forth between these tones in his speech. In the last fully transcribed paragraph of his speech, Otis then describes in a very comical way the various ways the writs can be used maliciously. Quote, every man prompted by revenge, ill humor, or wantonness to inspect of his neighbor's house may get a writ of assistance, end quote. He further declares that, quote, others will ask it from self-defense. One arbitrary exertion will provoke another until society be involved in tumult and in blood, end quote. These words create the image of an absurd scene with neighbors prying into each other's lives, also leading to a society that would be embroiled in conflict due to the prying eyes of strangers, which can end up leading to violence. This ends up working in his favor by showing the absurdity of the writs of assistance and how easily the writs of assistance can turn into a witch hunt, with neighbor turning on neighbor, leading to nothing good. Although Otis was unable to convince the court that the writs were illegal, the division that writs created were a catalyst for further conflict and division between the colonists in Britain due to regulations and taxation. John Adams, then a young law student, witnessed this court case in Otis's speech, which helped inspire him to fight against British hegemony, and he even claimed, then and there, independence was born.
And so, as we talked about, although the court case was lost, Otis did not win his case. Otis' speech is still significant because it translated directly into policy in the new nation, the United States. Earlier I talked about how Otis' concession was important because it was essentially a proposal for where the line regarding issuing a writ of assistance should be drawn. And we can see this same line clearly drawn in the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment of the Constitution reads, quote, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. What the Fourth Amendment basically says is that in order to conduct a search, a warrant must be issued on a reason to believe that the search is necessary, also known as probable cause. This is a term that you will hear a lot in it's a term from legal jargon. And this search warrant must also include where and what will be searched for. So this fits with Otis' position that searches being conducted during his era were occurring without justification, and that the searches and the reasons for the searches needed to be more specific. The Constitution even uses some of the same language that Otis used. When talking about the writs of assistance, Otis said that writs of assistance, quote, may be granted to certain persons on oath, end quote. We can see that same similar language in the Fourth Amendment. Clearly, Otis' ideas had a profound influence on the Constitution. And furthermore, the Fourth Amendment is arguably one of the most important laws in the country, as it is still utilized every day and necessary today. Something that can't be said about every law written over 200 years ago. So thank you for viewing our presentation, and here are our works cited, and then our image citations.